I guess we're right at 10:04. So let's get started up on the next session. And the next session is Identity and Access for Digital Microservices Platform. And I want to bring up Jack Hart and Wojo, because I'm not going to try Michael's last name, and come out and start us off. So off we go.
Hi, thanks for being here. We're honored to be able to present. This presentation is about identity and access for digital microservices platform.
So we are a financial services and products company serving the entertainment industry, doing production accounting, payroll services, budgeting, tax services. We were founded in 1976, and little anecdote, last year when Lucasfilms got bought by Disney, we finally retired our first 16-bit application. So in some form, we're still, thank you. In some form, we're still trying to modernize our environment. And we're trying to build a more modern platform and use all of the data that we have, because we have kind of an unparalleled look at our client from the view of data for 30 plus years.
Things we're going to be talking about today are identity standards, common UX, UI components, frameworks, and tech stack, adapting OIDC and OAuth for non-consumer use, our security model strategy, a little bit about microservices and APIs, and our deployment and solution management strategy, aka DevOps.
This is an infographic that we use with the business just to kind of show our vision for a platform, identity being on the forefront, all of our microservices being on the back end with our data, and talking about some of the standards that we're going to be using. So this is what we've been used to communicate to all of our business quite a bit, actually.
From the application perspective, there's a set of kind of architectural principles that we're building, and among these are common UI, UX components, frameworks, and tech stack. It's a lightweight application model featuring HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's isomorphic JavaScript, so we support both mobile and desktop. It's powered by microservice-based APIs supported by Apigee. We also use an aggregation tier for app-specific APIs, which is where we keep things like secrets and other volatile things that can't make their way all the way out to a JavaScript client. We are using an event stream for distributed coordination, kind of similar to what was mentioned in the previous presentation. We also use caching and platform search, and open standards include OpenID Connect, REST-based APIs, SCIM, and CI/CD automation.
So our work is to provide a simple, effective strategy for managing the identity and access for the platform and trying to adhere to the microservices architecture. Our principles include API management, common UI methodology, frameworks, analytics, data science capabilities, and DevOps solution management. We're trying to use strictly OIDC or OpenID Connect, and we're integrating OIDC and OAuth to provide the IAM capabilities to support integrated API management, and we're using both PingFederate and API Edge for API management.
For OIDC information, we're primarily just using the auth code grant type. The others aren't really applicable, and we've been warned away from implicit. We do use client credentials for non-sensitive server-to-server communications, where it doesn't really matter that we have identity involved. In our environment, this is not consumer IT, so the users don't own the resources that they're hitting. It's inappropriate to ask them to confirm scopes. All the scopes are provisioned, and the authorization screens aren't shown. In our environment, all of our applications are role-based access control, and it turns out there's a logical mapping between the functionality of an RBAC role and the OAuth scopes needed to execute that functionality. To log in with OIDC, you must make a request to an authorization endpoint. This is one of the things that we had to tweak a little bit to make it work in our environment. The application has to explicitly request the scopes required by the user, but there's a problem here. As I mentioned before, the resources are known for the user, so we don't ask permission. And when you have a multi-role app with multiple users, it's unreasonable to ask either the app or the user to remember what scopes map onto the role that they're a member of. In our environment, they may be in multiple roles on different projects in the same app. So that makes it even harder for them to keep that mapping. So we don't do that. As a result, we're using a small set of standard scopes to initiate the request. Those are OpenID to make it an OpenID Connect request. We use the profile scopes because we're using custom claims, and we also include email since we're using that as a subject. The custom claims in the ID token list both the RBAC roles and the related scopes. A second request would normally need to be made requesting the custom scopes, but we're using a facility in Apigee known as an external token support to allow us to inject the scopes from the custom claim in the ID token into the access token before we deliver it back to the client.
So our security model for the RBAC roles, all applications employ role-based access. Requirements to have the users members of different roles in the same application for different projects and studios. Our industry is very transient. We have a lot of people that are contractors that may work on multiple things at one time and actually be on different roles at one time. So the requirement is to filter those roles by application. For naming, we did application name, scoping element, and role name. Like for an onboarding app, working at the high studio level for MGM, and their role is production finance. Or for someone who's just doing accounting and being a timekeeper, working on the Flintstones project, and they're a production accountant. The application name is mapped to the OAuth client, and it allows for filtering of these roles by the application. And the scoping element determines the applicability for the role. Production finance role for the onboard app applies to the whole MGM org at the top level, and then the production accountant role for timekeeper applies only to the project, even though they may be part of a larger studio for that role.
There's a relationship between roles and scopes, an implicit mapping, and we've made that explicit. Essentially, the RBAC roles are represented by LDAP groups, and we have other LDAP groups representing the scopes. The users are members of the LDAP groups representing the RBAC roles, and the RBAC role itself is a member of groups representing the OAuth scopes. So it's kind of a transitive member of sort of relationship as depicted at the bottom there.
So naming conventions for our LDAP groups are API name, scope name, and then the word scope. The RBAC role is for the application, but it also needs to know the scopes. The custom claim representing the OAuth scopes serves three different purposes. It allows the access token scope injection for access to the services, allows the app to know which scopes have been provisioned for what user and what endpoints can be called, and allows us to optimize the token process with Apigee, obviating the need for a second OIDC auth code request directly requesting the scopes.
We're returning an access token, a refresh token, an ID token in these OIDC requests. The access token and refresh token, it's a reference token, and they're built through typical means in PingFederate. The ID token has two custom claims. Role represents the RBAC role name, and the scopes represent the scopes that are mapped onto that role. Both of these claims are using Ogonal, and some of this, part of the reason that we have these naming standards is to make the processing a little bit easier with Ogonal. Ogonal's a fairly obtuse language. That's an understatement.
And it's just an example of the role. You can see we have the subject, and then we have the role, timekeeper, Flintstones, production accountant, and then we have all of the scopes coming through for that particular token. Rest of it's standard.
Whoa. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the entire flow. I'm going to have to look at the big screen here to be able to read it. The first thing that happens is the user accesses the app. This is SP initiated. They have no sessions, so the app makes the call, redirects to the authorized endpoint. The next thing that happened is Apigee proxies this authorized call. The call is made to an endpoint on Apigee. Apigee turns around and proxies that back to PingFed. It also calls the OIDC discovery endpoint so that we can adjust to different environments and different configurations in OpenID Connect. The next thing that happens is PingFederate returns a 302 and Apigee proxies that back to the user, redirecting the user to authenticate. Assuming they're successful, the next thing that happens is Ping returns the auth code and Apigee hands it back to the app. After that, they make the token request, again hitting the endpoint on Apigee, passing the auth code and the parameters. Apigee proxies the token request back to Ping, and Ping returns the access token, refresh token, and the ID token. As it passes back through the proxy in Apigee, We validate the token, so all the tokens get validated before delivery. It also stores the token and the metadata and injects the scopes into the access token, then returns that to the app.
So provisioning for us is automated for both the apps and the users. For automation, we add the user to the RBAC groups, and then we add the RBAC groups to the OAuth scope groups. For app provisioning, add RBAC groups to the scope groups. User provisioning, add the user to the RBAC group. The Ping OAuth client, the client name must match the app name in the RBAC role in the LDAP group, so we can use the organal to parse it and create the name, create the app in Apigee. Apigee then creates the OAuth client key and secret. Then you create the API and API product on Apigee, which is kind of an internal function on Apigee itself.
One of the other things, just realizing this isn't maybe that clear, we have probably 25 different apps. Most of the users are members of multiple apps. If we didn't filter those things based on the OAuth client, it would put a lot of burden on each of the applications to do that filtering themselves. So, important things we're talking about, decisions we made, OpenID Connect being the identity standard that's moving forward, how we manage and provision scopes in a non-consumer IT environment, and then the various details of our implementation. This is an infographic that we use to sell this stuff around the company and to the business, and just to kind of make it a little bit more visual and understandable to some of the non-technical people. Real quick, I'll go through. This is actually up and working, and so I'll give you guys a little bit of taste of what it looks like. This is our custom experience. We built this using the reference adapter, so we're not using the HTML form adapter. And so this is what the user is redirected to log in. Making the request here, you can see here at the bottom, there's under these phase details, there's a variable over there called JWT scopes, and this is the stuff that was parsed out of the ID token. It's essentially turned into a Java object, and we perform reflection on it in a Java component in Apigee, pull out the various claims that are in the token, and then assign it to that variable, which lets us inject it into the access token. This is what the access token looks like. This is a different app than the one we were showing earlier, but again, you can see the custom claim with the role at the top and the second custom claim listing the scopes. This is a request, and this was all done. This is real. This isn't. We didn't want to do a live demo. It's kind of tempting fate, but these are all screenshots from a real scenario. This is an API request from that token that we just saw a minute ago. One of the nice things about it is when this access token, the reference token, crosses Apigee, as you can see here, we can pull up the ID token. We see the client ID, the access token, of course, refresh token. There's a whole lot of metadata that every time they make a request with an access token, all that metadata is visible because it's stored in Cassandra and Apigee. And so all of that's available. You can perform analytics queries over it and that kind of stuff. So it's pretty useful. It's a very small little token, but it essentially brings the entire context with it. Questions?
Let's take the microphone down so we can get some questions going.
Not bad.
I guess my question is, it looks like as you build scopes, it has like 3 or 4 pieces of information. Why not just store those as separate claims rather than having to have that concatenated as one big scope?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you rephrase that?
So your scopes, you talk about having 2 or 3 pieces of information concatenated together as a scope. My question is, why not store those as separate claims in the JOT?
This just is the design that we came up with. We have a lot of different APIs. Each of the APIs the scopes are mapped onto the APIs to allow them to be used by different applications, right? And so the scopes that are set on the APIs is something that's done with the API design, independent of the application. So we have to be able to pull those pieces apart, and those scopes need to be granular enough that they support basic decisions by different application designers who may want to parcel the functionality out differently. If it was all one scope or something, you wouldn't be able to do that. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but we didn't want to really build that into the ID token.
I was going to say, one of the comments that you brought up earlier that I was looking at was the fact that some of those roles are specific only to certain applications. And so if they were in as separate claims, losing one of the claims essentially is going to greaten the scope of one of the other ones, right? And so they are restrictive and putting them into...
You can have core scopes and then have claims and then do advocacy actions rather than rolling them.
You could.
Yeah.
Three claims that you look at rather than one big scope.
Well, yeah, so a couple pieces here. The role is for the app. The API knows nothing about the role, right? The role is for an application. I totally forgot what I was going to say. My bad.
Well, we'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
Sure, thanks. Sorry about that.
So thank you for sharing the architecture. I think part of it is we are doing very similar to this, and it kind of is validation. So one of the pushback that we have is basically from when you go from web access management, there is a lot of authorization that goes into web access management. When you transform from web access management to OAuth-based solution, the expectation is that the authorization is implicit for me. So we came up with a scope model that you have come up with as well. It is hierarchical in nature. It is basically action and a verb and noun kind of combination of it. Right. But how difficult is it to manage this kind of a role? And it's almost going to granular, fine-grained authorization managed at the authorization layer. And how complicated and how ease of operations has been for you with these kind of scopes?
It's not too bad. Essentially, the setup of the API essentially exposes the API on Apigee. At that point, we set up the scopes and we set up enforcement of the scopes on Apigee. Setup of the application then so the other piece of that, in addition to the Apigee setup, we install a set of scopes using that naming convention represented by LDAP groups in our directory. We're using AD now. We were probably going to cut to a faster directory because AD isn't very good for customer IAM. But during the provisioning of the API, we set up the LDAP groups that represent the scopes. Then when we provision the app itself, that mapping is made where the LDAP groups that represent the RBAC roles are made a member of the LDAP groups representing the scopes. So it's a transitive relationship. The user becomes a member of the group that represents the RBAC role for the application, which is separable from the API. But then that LDAP group is made a member of the groups representing the scope, so it establishes that link, that transitive link. I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Something like that, yes.
It's going to get a little bit hairy as we go along, but we needed the flexibility from an operational standpoint on managing the LDAP store. We kind of looked at that, but we also need the flexibility for the application. So we're going to have to do some adjusting for some of it to make it easy to work with. It is going to get a little hairy though, but on the opposite side of it, not doing that really hampered us on application development. So I come from the infrastructure side. He's more on the development side. So I'm always like beating him up over like, you're making this too complex. Stop it.
Yeah. The other thing is that we're automating almost all this, and we're working with Ping and with John DeSilva from Ping to use their admin API so that we can control our IAM configuration, and we will probably automate all this stuff with the LDAP groups as well. So provisioning, deprovisioning will happen through software rather than through manual means. We have been talking about that. At the moment, we're not using that, but we've looked at that and Pivotal and a couple other things. Docker.
Swarm.
Hi, sorry, I think I might have missed it. Did you say that you are generating a token on the front end and passing it down to your microservices, or are you reissuing a token downstream in your microservices like the previous speaker did?
No, it's not a reissue. We're not reissuing the token. We're injecting the information we get back into the access token.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, how does Ping scale to your environment?
Can you speak up a little bit? I can't hear you very well.
And also, just out of curiosity, how does Ping scale in your environment as a product?
The Ping clusters that we're using are 3-node clusters, 1 admin node, 2 engines. The scope injection is essentially what's happening is when we make that initial request from the client using just the 3 standard scopes, the initial token issued by Ping only has OpenID, profile, and email. That's all it's got. But because we're building that custom claim listing the scopes that are associated with the RBAC role into the ID token, we then take that data, and as it comes back, as that ID token comes back across Apigee from Ping, we then take, Apigee has a facility called external token support. And what it does is it basically grabs the access token and the ID token, it converts the ID token into a Java object, does reflection on it, pulls all the claims out. We look for that JWT scopes variable which gets assigned to that particular claim, and then we inject those scopes into the access token. And I think what that really means in the implementation of Apigee, although I haven't dug down to find out what actually is happening, is that essentially it's storing it in Cassandra. So here's the access token, stored along with it is the ID token and a list of the scopes. So when that token crosses Apigee on a regular API call, Cassandra is pretty lightning fast. This is happening in a few milliseconds, basically. That token comes across, and Apigee is able to say, okay, this token doesn't just have those 3 scopes, it has this whole set like we saw in the ID token. And so they're basically associated with that access token in Cassandra, and Apigee uses that to enforce it. If the endpoint that you're trying to access has one of the scopes that's possessed, then you're fine. Otherwise, it gives you an insufficient scope error. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And on the scaling, right now we're small enough to where we're not worried so much about scaling. We're going to have to start worrying it pretty soon. And if we ever move out to cloud, we know currently we have the JGroups problem with PingFederate and being able to scale easily. So we're taking it as we go. We're just kind of monitoring as heavily as possible, watching application performance and speeds and feeds, and see how we have to grow it. So we don't know. It's still to be determined.
The scopes, they display on the well-known configuration page. Do you see any security concerns?
For what?
Any security concerns to display all the list of scopes on a well-known configuration page?
On a well-known configuration page.
For OpenID Connect, there is a well-known configuration page where all the scopes, all the specs for OpenID Connect shown there.
I'm not super concerned about that. I don't think that really does anything to allow inappropriate access. We probably will look at the token binding stuff that's been discussed here. That is a concern. And there's been some discussion about how long should this access token be allowed to live, and it is a bearer token, so I mean it can be misused. So there are issues there, but yeah, I'm not particularly concerned with people knowing the names of our scopes. Our industry partners and clients will probably end up writing apps against this as well, so they'll know the names of the scopes.
Okay, yeah, very nice architecture, good work. So just so I understand, it sounds like you were passing what you call your access token is actually the reference token going back to the single page app.
It's an opaque reference.
Opaque reference token comes out, so that's all the clients ever see is that opaque thing, and then you turn it into a full access token. It's probably a JOT that you pass down to your internal microservices, or Apigee does that?
It depends. We've got about 4 or 5 apps that are kind of making their way onto the platform now. The last screens that you saw were a real app. That app has like 12 roles and 25 scopes or so. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Yeah, so that reference token doesn't get passed down to the microservices. They're actually getting a JOT with all of the claims? Or?
This first app that is farthest along, yeah, I follow you now. The first app that's coming on that has the 25 scopes, the way they've chopped up their API, they don't really need to do any further access control, we don't think. We're playing with that right now. But they've mapped the scopes onto their endpoints in such a way that there's no need to do any data filtration. It's set for mostly internal roles. That particular app is for hiring background actors, right? So there's a hiring manager that doesn't have access to the PII scope, for example, because they shouldn't. And there's things like that, but there probably will be. When we get to our accounting apps, we're probably going to have to figure out a scheme to pass back either the ID token, some fragment thereof of it, or perhaps a header or a set of headers that will allow that API to do back-end data filtration. Apigee can't be involved in that. It has to be coarse-grained.
Yeah, that was
stuff
my
that
next
happens.
question. Does Apigee do some of the authorization checks up front before it even passes a request through, or do you just?
Well, if you've been issued an ID token that has the scopes built into it, and we've injected those into your access token, as long as you're calling the endpoints associated with your role, you're going to go straight through. Right. Now, there will be with our there's another piece that we're kind of considering playing with that'll do blocking and tackling at the URI level, and that stuff may become necessary as well in the accounting apps, and there was almost certainly some data filtration that'll have to happen. So we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but the first app that we're doing here doesn't require it, so it's pretty clean, and they don't really, the back-end API doesn't really even concern itself with security.
Well, we're running right at the end of time, and I suggest you have that follow-up right when we sit and talk. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you all for coming, and the next talk will be in about 10 minutes.